He lifted the blade into the pale morning over Bamberg. On May 1st, 1573, a 19-year-old named Frantz Schmidt walked into the town square not as a spectator, but as the man charged to carry out the law. Before him knelt a condemned thief, bound, trembling, and already halfway into the silence that follows a verdict. When Schmidt raised the sword for the first time, he felt more than metal in his hands. He felt the weight of his family's fate, the statutes of an empire, and the long shadow of a profession that society needed, yet would not embrace. With a single measured stroke, he began a career that would end 394 lives and define his own. Frantz was not born a butcher of men. He was born an inheritance. His father, Heinrich Schmidt, had been a woodcutter until the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach conscripted him into the office of executioner, an order impossible to decline. From that moment, the surname Schmidt became a mark of social exile. In the Holy Roman Empire, executioners were essential and untouchable at once, hired by councils, shunned by neighbors. Their children were often barred from guilds, from pulpits, from respectable crafts. The role placed bread on the table and a wall around the house. Frantz's response to that wall was not flight, but resolve. Under his father's instruction in the town of Hof, he learned the discipline of the trade, how to make punishment swift, how to keep ceremony orderly, how to ensure the law spoke clearly through action. Yet it was in Bamberg, a rising administrative center in Franconia, where he first stepped from practice into history. He later recorded the moment in the precise hand that would preserve his life's work. On the first day of May, 1573, I took up the sword for the first time at Bamberg. It reads like a ledger line, but it marks a threshold, a young man receiving the empire's charge. What happened that day was not spectacle for its own sake. Town councils across the empire, including Bamberg's, hired executioners on formal contracts and paid them like any other civic officer. The entries were spare. Frantz Schmidt, execution carried out. But beneath the bureaucratic language stood a reality few wanted to face. A community that needed justice also needed someone to enact it. They would avert their eyes in the marketplace and then gather at the square when the sentence came due. From the start, Schmidt aimed at something almost no executioner dared hope for: legitimacy. Over the next 2 decades, he became one of the most sought-after professionals in the empire. He did not merely perform sentences, he systematized them. Punctual, sober, exacting, he turned a stigmatized craft into a visible arm of urban governance. His rise was not only personal, it was a stark lesson in how, within the Holy Roman Empire, law could lift even the outcast, if he wielded its instruments with unerring steadiness. The sword became his signature, not as a symbol of cruelty, but of precision and restraint. Where others might falter, he did not. Where chaos might creep in, he kept order. He understood that in a society where justice was public, the manner of its delivery mattered as much as its verdict. The town needed to see control, not rage, ceremony, not chaos. In that space between fear and function, Schmidt lived, an official everyone relied upon and few would greet. In his pages, the tone remained steady. Dates, names, places, payments, and the calm cadence of duty. Yet the subtext is unmistakable. He stood at the center of a system that asked him to be invisible and indispensable at once. He answered by perfecting the role he had never asked for, proving that in an age when law wore a public face, an executioner's steadiness could be a city's reassurance. The market squares of Franconia knew his presence well. By the late 1570s and into the 1580s, Frantz Schmidt was no longer a novice. He was the embodiment of a ritual that towns demanded, feared, and paradoxically relied upon. Crowds gathered whenever the platform was built, children perched on barrels, merchants pulling their aprons close. The condemned would kneel, often pale but still, and the silence that followed was broken by a single, flawless stroke. Schmidt's work was not dramatic. It was deliberate, and that was precisely why communities trusted him. Between 1573 and 1617, Schmidt recorded the execution of 394 people, but each entry in his diary reveals not chaos, but method. Every death was inscribed in the framework of imperial law, shaped by local customs, bound within a choreography of justice. For municipal councils, Schmidt was not a figure of cruelty. He was a civil servant, a necessary guardian of order. The public square was his courtroom, the blade his verdict. On July 15, 1589, for instance, he wrote with brevity, "I beheaded Andreas Rascher with the sword. He had murdered a man on the road to Würzburg." The words are stark, but they reveal his professionalism. Execution by the sword was considered an honorable form of punishment, often reserved for male offenders of higher social status. Unlike the rope or the wheel, the blade allowed the condemned to meet their end with a certain dignity. Yet dignity demanded precision. A single mistake could turn ritual into disaster, leaving the victim writhing and the crowd horrified. Schmidt did not miss. His reputation rested on mastery, and by all accounts, his hand never failed. Other sentences were less merciful. On April 3, 1587, Schmidt presided over the punishment of a serial killer, a crime deemed too severe for the sword alone. Here the law called for the wheel, a punishment designed not only to end life, but to extend suffering. Limbs were struck and broken one by one, the body pinned against spokes, the agony prolonged. Schmidt's account of the event is brief, clinical even, but its implications are chilling. These were not punishments of expedience. They were messages, carefully staged to remind all who watched of the consequences of transgression. Punishments also reflected societal expectations of gender. In one case, Schmidt carried out the sentence of Sackstoss, or death by drowning in a sack, against a woman condemned for infanticide. This ancient Germanic penalty involved sewing the woman into a weighted sack, sometimes with animals placed inside, and consigning her to the water. Such judgments were less about crime alone, and more about symbolic purification, an attempt to cleanse the community of what was seen as an intolerable moral offense. For Schmidt, it was another line in his ledger. For the community, it was ritual absolution. Even fire lay within his duties. Those convicted of heresy, witchcraft, or the use of poison faced execution by burning. To the authorities, flames did more than destroy. They purified. The crowd stood in heavy silence as smoke curled upward. The condemned, transformed into an emblem of transgression, erased. Once more, Schmidt's role was not sadism, but solemn function. He kept order. He made certain the process carried through without chaos or cruelty beyond what the law decreed. His precision was not for mercy's sake, it was for the state's. Through these decades, Frantz Schmidt became more than an executioner. He became an institution, his presence both feared and depended upon. Towns needed him at the center of their rituals of justice, and he answered that need with a steadiness that few could match. In his hands, the empire's laws were not abstractions. They were lived, enacted, and witnessed, etched not only in parchment, but in the memories of those who watched from the square. And as his ledger grew, so did the paradox. He was reviled as untouchable, yet trusted above all to deliver law's most final sentence. He was marked by dishonor, yet his very perfection lent dignity to justice itself. In a world where the law was ceremony, and ceremony required a figure, Schmidt became both the hand of the state and its most reluctant symbol. By the turn of the 17th century, Frantz Schmidt's career had spanned decades. He had stood on countless scaffolds, in markets and courtyards from Bamberg to Nuremberg, and delivered sentences with the precision that defined his reputation. Yet what makes his story extraordinary is not simply the number of executions, but the strange dignity he managed to carve from a profession defined by dishonor. Executioners in the Holy Roman Empire lived under a paradox. They were officers of the law, vital to its functioning, yet they were treated as social outcasts. They carried out justice, but bore its stigma. Neighbors shunned them, guilds refused them, and even their children inherited suspicion. For most, it was a life lived at the edge of society, their work acknowledged only in whispers and in ledgers. Schmidt refused that destiny. He did not run from his role. He embraced it and transformed it into a position of solemn authority. Every execution he conducted was carefully recorded in his diary, not in the language of cruelty, but in the tone of duty. His writings show no indulgence in pain, no triumph in another's end. Instead, they reflect a man who saw himself as the hand of order, an extension of the law rather than a figure of vengeance. Where others might have faltered, Schmidt ensured that the act was swift, precise, and as free of chaos as possible. This was not kindness, it was discipline. To him, imperfection in his task would have been both a failure of his profession and an insult to the authority of the empire. In one entry, he described the execution of a thief with the same brevity he used to note the punishment of a murderer. In another, he chronicled the sentence of burning for heresy, observing not the flames themselves, but the law that had decreed them. Such restraint gave his records a chilling clarity. They reveal the way justice was staged in the Holy Roman Empire, not as a hidden process, but as a public ritual. People came not merely to witness punishment, but to see the law embodied in human form. Schmidt became that embodiment. His dark attire, his calm demeanor, and his flawless technique turned executions into ceremonies that reinforced civic order. To the council, he was a civil servant. To the people, he was both a reminder and a warning. And to himself, he was a man attempting to redeem a family name bound to dishonor. What is striking about Schmidt's legacy is how he sought legitimacy in a role designed to deny it. Many executioners were remembered only for the terror they inspired. Schmidt ensured he would be remembered for precision and for duty. Over time, he became one of the most respected officials in Nuremberg, not because people liked him, but because they trusted him to perform the hardest task with unwavering discipline. His work tells us much about the society he served. The empire needed visible justice. It needed order, written not just in laws, but in actions witnessed by all. And so it relied on men like Schmidt, both reviled and essential, to make the state's authority visible. His story illustrates a larger truth. In an age when justice was spectacle, the executioner stood not at the margins of society, but at its very center. Yet even as he carried out his duties, Schmidt looked beyond the scaffold. His life was not only about death. Quietly, he nurtured a different ambition, one that would eventually redefine his legacy and prove that even a man marked by blood could one day be remembered with honor. In the final years of his career, the figure who had once been shunned for his profession began to shift in the public eye. Frantz Schmidt was not content to remain only the hand of death. With every execution carried out, he had also studied the human body, its strengths, its weaknesses, its limits. Decades of handling the condemned had given him knowledge of anatomy few outside physicians possessed. Where others saw only cruelty in his role, Schmidt quietly prepared for a transformation. By 1617, after 44 years of service and 394 executions, Schmidt laid down the sword. He did not vanish into obscurity, nor did he retreat into silence. Instead, he declared a new vocation: healing. Drawing on the anatomical expertise gained in his long years of duty, he began to practice as a healer in Nuremberg. He treated wounds, set broken bones, and prescribed herbal remedies. Those who once recoiled from his presence now came seeking his help. Where once his hands had ended lives, they now restored them. This shift was remarkable, not only for Schmidt, but for the society around him. Executioners were supposed to remain outside the boundaries of respectability. They were meant to be reminders of punishment, not figures of trust. Yet Schmidt's skill and reputation began to erode those barriers. His home became a place where townspeople arrived in hope rather than fear. His diary, once filled with records of death, now included notes on treatments and cures. Recognition followed. In 1624, Emperor Ferdinand II issued a decree that changed Schmidt's life forever. For the first time in memory, an executioner was formally declared ehrlich, honorable. The decree removed the stain of his profession, restoring him to full social standing. Legally and socially, Schmidt was no longer untouchable. He was recognized as a man of worth, equal to those who had once refused to share his company. It was a stunning reversal, one that reveals the contradictions of the age. The very empire that had forced his family into a life of dishonor now rewarded his discipline with dignity. The same society that had turned its back on him now sought his aid. Schmidt, who had been the symbol of the law's severity, became proof of the law's capacity to forgive. When he died in 1634, he was buried not as a pariah, but as a respected citizen of Nuremberg. His gravestone bore no emblem of disgrace, no whisper of dishonor. Instead, it remembered him as both the hand of justice and the heart of a healer. His story endures as a paradox, a man whose life was bound to blood, yet whose legacy became one of order, precision, and ultimately honor. Frantz Schmidt's life forces us to confront a difficult question. Can a life shaped by punishment end in redemption? His story suggests that even within the darkest professions, there is space for transformation. He was both executioner and healer, both feared and respected, both excluded and embraced. In the silence of his grave lies the truth that justice, in his time, was never simple. It was lived, enacted, and embodied in the figure of a man who carried the empire's weight with steady hands. And so, centuries later, the name Frantz Schmidt remains not only in records of death, but in the enduring question his life left behind. Can honor grow out of dishonor? And can society ever truly accept the hand that once delivered its severest judgments? The grave of Frantz Schmidt in Nuremberg stands as a quiet reminder that history does not always follow a straight line of shame or redemption. Where most executioners were remembered only as shadows, Schmidt left behind a written record that elevated him above silence. His meticulous diary, preserved to this day, catalogued not just names and sentences, but the very rhythm of justice in the Holy Roman Empire. Each entry, precise and restrained, reads less like the words of a brute and more like those of a civil servant, a man who saw himself as an extension of the law rather than a monster outside it. In many ways, this diary is his true legacy. It transformed an executioner into a historian of crime, a witness to the darkest corners of human society. Through his notes, we learn of thieves and killers, of betrayals and confessions, and of the rituals that bound punishment to the spectacle of justice. For modern readers, these pages open a window into a world where crime and punishment were inseparable from the public eye. Each execution was not just an end, but a message written in flesh and ceremony, witnessed by entire communities. Yet beyond the details of punishment, the diary reveals a man who yearned for legitimacy. Schmidt was not content to accept the role society had thrust upon him. Instead, he wielded it with such precision that it became a pathway to respect. His life illustrates how the boundaries between honor and dishonor could be blurred, reshaped, and even broken when one's skill aligned with the needs of the state. He was feared, yes, but he was also indispensable. As centuries passed, the figure of Frantz Schmidt grew into something larger than himself. Historians, lawyers, and moralists studied his record not only for its gruesome details, but for its humanity. Here was an executioner who wrote without malice, who treated his role with solemnity, and who sought to balance the weight of death with the hope of healing. His dual life, as both executioner and physician, makes him one of the most unusual figures in European history. What makes his story even more compelling is the way it forces us to reconsider justice itself. Was Schmidt simply a tool of cruelty? Or was he a man performing the necessary work of his society with precision and discipline? Can we see him as both? His official pardon in 1624 suggests that even the empire recognized the paradox, that a man stained by dishonor could embody order more perfectly than many born into respectability. Today, his memory stands at a crossroads of history and morality. On one hand, he is the image of state power made flesh, the hand that struck at the empire's command. On the other, he is the figure who broke through the boundaries of dishonor, who sought not only to execute but to heal. In him, the contradictions of justice and humanity converge. Frantz Schmidt's life compels us to ask uncomfortable questions. Where does justice end and cruelty begin? Can those who enforce the harshest laws ever be seen as honorable? And perhaps most haunting of all, if society could one day forgive an executioner, what does that reveal about the way history chooses who is remembered and who is forgotten? His stone in the cemetery bears no shame, only a name. And that name continues to echo centuries later as a reminder that even in the darkest roles, humanity leaves its trace.